The 10,202nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Estonia, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Kayoko Goto, Director for Europe and Central Asia, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations. And Mr. Indrika Ratwate, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite Mr. Quentin Weiler, Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Kayoko Goto.
Mr. President, Excellencies, since we last briefed this Council on 9 July, more than 170 civilians have reportedly been killed and 1,028 injured across Ukraine as a result of intensified aerial attacks by the Russian Federation. Residential buildings, playgrounds, gas stations, markets, and logistical warehouses have been hit. Kyiv has remained under constant bombardment. Just yesterday, the 8th major missile attack on the city this month struck the residential building. 3 people were reportedly injured. In July alone, at least 56 civilians have reportedly been killed and 232 injured in Kyiv. Daily attacks are also being reported in frontline communities in the Donetsk, Kharkiv, Sumy, Kherson, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. With many civilians killed by so-called guided aerial bombs with greater capability for accurate long-distance targeting. In one such attack on 24 July, at least 6 people were reportedly killed and 9 others injured after guided aerial bombs struck the city of Slovyansk. Residential buildings, businesses, and the honorary consulate of Latvia were damaged. Earlier, on 11 July, guided aerial bombs struck residential areas in Sumy, killing 5 civilians, including a girl, and injuring 41 others, including children. In recent weeks, the Odessa region has been particularly heavily affected by repeated deadly strikes. Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, has verified that just this month, the Odessa region suffered at least 26 civilian deaths and 92 injuries. In total, since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion, OHCHR has verified that at least 1,431 civilians, including 803 children, have been killed in Ukraine. 48,613 more, including 2,960 children, have been injured. These figures account only for verified casualties. Actual figures are likely higher. Mr. President, as we reported in our last briefing, the summertime escalation has had an increasingly destructive impact on the areas of Ukraine temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. On Saturday, occupying authorities reported that 12 people, including 5 children, were killed in a drone attack on a holiday camp in the Russian-occupied part of Ukraine's Zaporizhia region. In the Russian-occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukrainian drone strikes on electrical substations have reportedly led to prolonged power and water outages across the peninsula. Inside the Russian Federation, local authorities continue to report increasing numbers of civilian casualties following Ukrainian strikes on oil and other industrial infrastructure in multiple regions, including most recently in Belgorod. They also report that commercial buildings and warehouses are increasingly targeted, with deadly consequences for civilians. On 24 July, in Kirov region, northwest of Moscow, at least 6 people were reportedly killed and more than 24 others injured, following attacks on industrial and logistical centers. On 18 July, Ukrainian drones reportedly hit large online retail warehouses in Tambov and Moscow regions, killing 8 people and injuring more than 60 others. Similar attacks have been reported almost daily since then. In the first half of the year, OHCHR has recorded reports by local authorities of 1,846 civilian casualties, 250 killed, and 1,596 injured in the Russian Federation. This represents a 121% increase compared with the same period in 2025. Mr. President, international humanitarian law clearly prohibits attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. As we repeatedly and consistently stress in all our briefings, these attacks are unacceptable, inexcusable, and must stop now. The United Nations continues to unequivocally condemn such attacks wherever they occur. Mr. President, for well over 4 years, the war in Ukraine has disrupted global energy and food supplies. As Ukraine has entered a new harvest season, the escalation of Russian attacks on ports and cargo ships in recent weeks raises renewed alarm about the wider regional and global impacts of this war. The Black Sea ports of Odessa, Chernomorsk, Pivdeny, Izmail, and Mykolaiv have been subjected to renewed systematic attacks by the Russian Federation. In Odessa region, more than half a dozen attacks on civilian vessels were reported this month, reportedly killing or injuring 44 crew members. Many of the ships impacted by the strikes have been under third country flags and carrying food products. In one of the deadliest such attacks on 20 July, Russian missiles reportedly struck a Guinea-Bissau flagged ship near the port of Odessa, killing 10 people. The ship was carrying grain, and its crew consisted of Indian and Syrian nationals. Earlier, on 13 July, another Russian strike reportedly hit a Togolese flagged vessel, unloading mineral fertilizers at the port of Odessa, killing 5 people, including 3 crew members, and injuring 10. In addition to attacks on ports and civilian ships, the Russian Federation has also intensified attacks on Ukraine's food industry infrastructure, agricultural equipment and fields, destroying crops ready for harvest and export. 4 out of the 13 major grain terminals in Odessa region ports have reportedly suspended their grain purchases due to threat of attacks. At the same time, Ukraine has expanded attacks against Russian and Russian-linked maritime logistics, including oil tankers. More than 100 vessels have reportedly been struck in the Sea of Azov in July, prompting restrictions on navigation in the Sea of Azov. The consequences of this latest escalation are already visible in global agricultural markets. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, wheat prices have climbed 20% from the beginning of the month and are at their highest since March 2024. Further disruption in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, as well as in other critical areas, could drive up freight, insurance, food, and energy costs, with grave consequences for vulnerable and import-dependent developing countries. We urge maximum restraint against actions that endanger civilian maritime navigation. Mr. President, on 15 July, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, reported that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant experienced its 22nd complete loss of offsite power since the start of the war. 10 such incidents have occurred in the past 3 months alone, underscoring the deteriorating reliability of the electrical grid necessary for safe operations of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. IAEA has also expressed concern over several drone attacks in the nearby town of Enerhoda, under the temporary occupation of the Russian Federation, where many of the plant's staff reside. The persistent physical danger adds to the extremely difficult circumstances under which they continue to work tirelessly to safeguard the plant's operations. As we have reiterated in our previous briefings, any military actions endangering the safety and security of nuclear plants are unconscionable and irresponsible. We urge maximum restraint to avoid any risk of a nuclear accident. Mr. President, as hostilities continue to intensify, their devastating toll on civilians and infrastructure critical to civilian lives, and a far-reaching impact on global food security, underscore once again the urgent need for renewed diplomatic efforts. We must not allow this dangerous escalatory spiral to continue. We urge all concerned to resume dialogue and inclusive negotiations aimed at de-escalation and at securing an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire. This would serve as a critical and necessary step towards a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions. The United Nations continue to stand ready to make available its tools and expertise in support of all meaningful efforts to that end. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame.
I thank Ms. Goto for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Indrika Ratwate.
Mr. President, Excellencies, since this Council last met 2.5 weeks ago, civilians have again been killed and injured, homes reduced to rubble, electricity and water cut. The United Nations warehouses and other humanitarian facilities damaged, destroying aid meant for civilians. And still, every day, humanitarian organizations continue to respond across Ukraine. In Odessa, in Mykolaiv, where homes and buses and energy infrastructure have been struck. In Kharkiv, Dnipro, Sumy, and Zaporizhzhia, where repeated aerial attacks continue to disrupt daily life. In Kiev, where families are once again clearing debris from apartment buildings after last week's attacks. And in communities closer to the front line, including Donetsk and Kherson, where shelling and drone attacks remain a daily reality. We must not allow such repeated attacks to make this suffering seem so routine. We also remain concerned by reports of civilian harm in the Russian Federation, even if the United Nations cannot verify these independently. Long-range drone attacks have reportedly continued to cause civilian casualties and damage infrastructure. For example, on 17th and 18th July, Russian authorities have reported attacks, including strikes on the Wildberries Logistics Center in Moscow and Tambov regions that killed 8 civilians and caused injuries to 86 others. Different cities, different attacks, the same result. Civilians paying the price. This must never become normal. Mr. President, each round of attacks bring renewed harm to civilians. More families grieve, more homes are damaged, more essential services are cut, and more communities are forced to put recovery on hold. For many communities, this is now the 4th summer spent under the shadow of continued hostilities, while fearful about the winter to come. For others, suffering has lasted even longer. Mr. President, as tactics and scope of this conflict shift, so too must the way in which humanitarian organizations work. Every morning begins with the same question: how can we reach people safely? The question is becoming harder to answer. Aid supplies are moved, warehouses are relocated, convoy routes are reviewed. The work changes, but the purpose does not. Even as humanitarian organizations respond to today's emergencies, they are already preparing for winter. They are pre-positioning supplies, supporting repairs to homes and critical infrastructure. Last week, they launched the annual winter response plan because communities already battered by war cannot be left to face another winter without support. Mr. President, humanitarian actors remain determined to reach people in need despite this difficult and challenging environment. They continue to deliver food, emergency shelter, cash assistance, healthcare, and psychological support to millions of people. Local responders continue to reach communities under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Amidst these challenges, practical humanitarian arrangements can save lives. They can support safe and voluntary evacuation of civilians and allow life-saving aid to reach civilians in need. OCHA remains committed to pursuing such practical arrangements. Mr. President, 4.5 years since the escalation of hostilities, the dangers civilians face and the way humanitarian organizations work have changed. But the obligation of parties under international humanitarian law remain unchanged and unequivocal. Wherever the parties take their military operations, civilians, including humanitarians, must be protected. The infrastructure civilians depend on must be spared. Humanitarian relief must be allowed to reach civilians in need. The parties must honor the protective purpose of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we will keep adapting because civilians need us to adapt. We will replace destroyed supplies. We will continue working alongside local responders and continue helping civilians. But our determination should not be confused with acceptance. Humanitarian organizations find ways to keep working because this is their job. But that does not make these conditions acceptable. Nor should the extraordinary determination of civilians be mistaken for an unlimited ability to endure suffering. Humanitarian organizations will keep doing everything they can, but they cannot compensate for failures to uphold the protective aim of international humanitarian law. The responsibility to spare civilians and meet their essential needs rests with the parties to the conflict. Those with influence over them have a responsibility as well. International law is not optional. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank Mr. Ratwater for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I thank Director Goto and Acting Secretary General Ratwate for their detailed and factual briefings. The briefings today clearly demonstrate that Russia continues to intensify a deliberate campaign against civilians in densely populated areas. On 19th of July, Kiev endured yet again one of the largest reported missile attacks since the start of the full-scale invasion, while guided aerial bombs struck residential areas of the city of Zaporizhia. Deadly attacks against Ukrainian civilians continue daily. On 24th of July, in an attack against the frontline city of Slavyansk, Donetsk region, a Russian Kab-250 guided aerial bomb destroyed the building of Latvia's honorary consulate, the only permanently working European presence serving the frontline region. There were no military installations or objects nearby. That day in Slavyansk, at least 6 civilians were killed and dozens more injured, including 2 staff members of our consulate. And we express our deepest condolences to the families of those killed in these attacks, barbaric attacks, and wish full and fast recovery to all injured. Latvia strongly condemns Russia's attack against our honorary consulate, and we thank our partners for their solidarity. Mr. President, the aggressor has to be stopped. Over 66,000 civilians have been killed or injured in Ukraine since 2022. Damage and destruction of housing stock has affected 3 million households in the first 4 years of this war. Latvia condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's complete disregard of international humanitarian law. Russia can destroy buildings. It cannot break Ukraine's will for freedom, nor Latvia's unwavering support to it. Consequences of Russia's war of aggression spill over beyond Ukraine's borders. Russia's reckless and escalatory actions in Europe continue. We express our solidarity with our ally Romania, whose airspace has been violated by drone incursions for these 3 consecutive days, a direct consequence of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And I have to draw the Council's attention that on 19th of July in Riga, Latvia, a civil society warehouse storing humanitarian aid for Ukraine was set ablaze. Latvia's law enforcement institutions are conducting an investigation into this act of sabotage. Mr. President, Russia's deliberate attacks directly affect global food security. Before Russia's aggression, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the world. Ukraine was the main sourcing country for the World Food Programme, providing 19.8% of all quantities sourced and feeding around 400 million people in humanitarian emergencies. Even now, Ukraine remains a vital hub for the UN humanitarian food procurement for global crisis zones, from Gaza and Sudan to Bangladesh, while simultaneously delivering food aid to millions of Ukrainians on the front lines. Despite having 19% of its agricultural land occupied and over 25% of its territory suspected of contamination by mines and exploded ordnance. On 17th of July, the World Food Programme warehouse in the city of Dnipro was attacked by drones 4 times in the span of 24 hours. These are not isolated incidents. World Food Programme has registered more than 90 such attacks over the last 2 years. On 19th July, 3 Russian cruise missiles hit a Guinea-Bissau flagged Turkey-owned civilian grain ship, killing 10 crew members from India and Syria, and the Ukrainian pilot. Again, not an isolated case. Civilian merchant ships and ports are regular Russian targets. Over the past month, there have been increased reports of Russia's drones deliberately dropping incendiary munitions on crop fields across Ukraine to burn down this year's harvest. Mr. President, Russia is the sole obstacle to an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire we are all calling for. Russia continues to use imperialist and neocolonial justifications and means in its war against the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and international human rights. Ukraine has our full support in its fight for its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Director Goto and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwate for their informative briefings. Mr. President, in the early hours of 19 July, Russia continued its relentless attacks against Ukrainian cities and fired dozens of ballistic missiles onto civilians in urban areas. Many of these civilians were either sleeping in their beds or desperately trying to reach shelters. This constituted one of the largest ballistic missile attacks of Russia's unjustified war. Tragically, that night last week was far from the only recent occasion when Ukrainian non-combatants and civilian infrastructure have been hit by deadly and clearly escalating Russian drone and missile attacks. On 24 July, a ballistic missile attack on a gathering of engineers, entrepreneurs, and industrialists outside Kyiv killed at least 11 and injured more than 100. And glide bomb attacks the same day flattened the center of Sloviansk with multiple-story residential buildings, coffee shops, and supermarkets destroyed. At least 5 civilians were killed and 15 more injured. These same attacks also destroyed the honorary consulate of fellow Security Council member Latvia. Denmark deplores these attacks and the tragic loss of life. This is a violation of international law. We stand together with Latvia and Ukraine. Russia's recent attacks also severely damaged WFP, WHO, and UNICEF facilities used to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable victims of this aggression. This was just days after an early attack hit another Red Cross warehouse in Kyiv, all part of a deeply alarming and unacceptable pattern of attacks impacting humanitarian facilities. Denmark has repeatedly called for international humanitarian law to be respected in all cases, without exception. There can be no justification for firing dozens of ballistic and hypersonic missiles on Ukraine civilians. No pretext for highly explosive weapons with wide area effects in densely populated urban areas. Such acts constitute a blatant disregard of IHL, and those responsible must be held to account. As the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported a few days ago, first May and then June broke the grim record for the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since 2022. July, regrettably, seems to be heading in the same direction. This Council, the body with primary responsibility for safeguarding international peace and security, must not allow this to continue. Mr. President, Ukraine has the right to defend itself in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. As the leaders of the NATO summit in Ankara and at the Coalition of the Willing meeting in Paris earlier this month made clear, we stand united in our unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Denmark will continue to support Ukraine, including through providing humanitarian, economic, and security assistance, and stands ready with our allies to provide robust security guarantees. Ukraine cannot be denied the right to protect its civilians. The senseless killings needs to stop, and Russia's illegal war must end. Denmark stands in full solidarity with Romania, following the recent drone incursions and violations of its airspace. Russia's illegal war continues to pose a long-term threat to European security and must be brought to an end. Mr. President, in closing, Denmark once again reiterates our call for Russia to engage in good faith negotiations to achieve a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. As a vital first step, we call on Russia to accept an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire. Over the last weeks and months, every Council member except Russia has made this call. The time is now for Russia to heed this call. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representatives. Thank you, Mr. President. I first of all wish to thank Ms. Keiko Goto, Director for Europe, Central Asia and the Americas, and the Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Enrique Ratuarte. I thank both for their statements. I wish to also thank the humanitarian personnel deployed in Ukraine to serve the civilians that have fallen victim to this in these events. We meet now to address Russia's aggression against Ukraine. At the same time, Russia continues to refuse clearly and brazenly to give a chance to peace negotiations. Moscow is continuing and even ratcheting up its policy of large-scale airstrikes against major Ukrainian cities. It is indiscriminately targeting civilian areas using drones and ballistic missiles and causing scores of deaths and wounding equal numbers, namely in the capital, as we have just been reminded, in Sloviansk. The honorary consulate of Latvia was hit and 2 of its staff members were wounded. We express our full solidarity with Ukraine and Latvia. We also express our support for Romania, again confronted by drone incursions into its airspace. This Council must also acknowledge the full magnitude of the highly calculated offensive that Russia resumed a few weeks ago against Ukraine's agricultural exports. Ms. Goto described in the most precise terms by attacking and deliberately destroying Odessa port infrastructure, as well as vessels transporting Ukrainian grain in the Black Sea and a WFP warehouse in Dnipro. Russia is not only killing innocent civilians, but it is directly imperiling the food security of millions of individuals, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, going back to a policy that we hoped had been abandoned, a policy from the beginning of this war. Finally, we decry the targeted attacks against humanitarian facilities essential for the recovery of Ukrainian civilians. A WHO warehouse housing medical treatments and a UNICEF warehouse containing support equipment to assist the civilian population have also been destroyed by Russian strikes in recent days. These attacks clearly violate international humanitarian law. President, in the face of this continued dangerous escalation, France reaffirms its tireless support to Ukraine. Alongside G7 at Evian, with NATO in Ankara, and with the Coalition of the Willing in Paris held on the 13th of July, we confirmed our active and tangible support for Ukraine. Ukraine has endured and continues to endure and exercise its right to self-defense in accordance with the UN Charter. We have mobilized fully to create the conditions for a just and lasting peace in accordance with the principles of international law and the United Nations Charter, buttressed by robust security guarantees. President, after 4 years of war, Russia has not yet succeeded in achieving its goals on the front. At the same time, it continues to place the cost of this devastating war squarely on the shoulders of the Ukrainian people. The Secretary General of the United Nations has long called for an immediate, comprehensive, and unconditional ceasefire. He's not the only one to do so. His appeal is supported by the overwhelming majority of member states from across all continents, including, of course, France. Instead of further fueling the escalation of this war, it is high time that Moscow finally heed these appeals. Moscow must put an end to fighting, engage in direct negotiations with Ukraine with the participation of the United States and Europeans. We are ready to foster progress on this front. The Council must also do its part. Thank you. I wish to thank the representative of France for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece. Thank you, Mr. President.
I'll begin by thanking you for convening this meeting, and Director Goto, as well as Acting Assistant Secretary General Atuate, for their remarks. Mr. President, we meet once again in the aftermath of successive waves of indiscriminate Russian strikes across Ukraine, including the largest ballistic missile attack so far on the 18th and 19th of July, causing scores of civilian casualties and extensive damage to residential areas and civilian infrastructure in Kiev and many other parts of the country, including the Black Sea. Between 17th and 20th of July, nearly 60 civilians were killed and around 370 were injured. Among the targets was a recreation park in Odessa, and children was once more again among the victims. Russia has since renewed its attacks, resulting in further deaths and injuries and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Most recently, the honorary consulate in Latvia, in Sloviansk, was attacked and severely damaged. Diplomatic and consular premises should never be targeted. We strongly condemn the clear violation of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations and stand in full solidarity with Latvia and Ukraine. Our thoughts are with those affected by these attacks. We also stand in solidarity with Romania over the repeated incursions of drones into Romania's airspace. Any violation of the airspace and territorial integrity of a sovereign state constitutes a clear breach of international law and is unacceptable. Over the past few months, Russia has significantly increased its use of ballistic missiles and glide bombs against densely populated areas, along with the scale and intensity of these attacks with devastating consequences. Civilian casualties from such attacks rose by 60% compared to 2025. This war has a particular impact on women and girls, with the respective casualties increasing significantly by 34% this year. We join UN Women in calling for an urgent end to the violence and for the gender-responsive humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, this Council has convened repeatedly in recent months due to Russia's attacks. But every new strike is further reason to prevent the current status quo of this war from becoming the norm. The international community must not become desensitized to the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Greece strongly condemns the latest pattern of attacks by Russia and calls for urgent de-escalation. We also deplore the increasing trend of repeated strikes against UN agencies in Ukraine, including WFP, WHO, and UNICEF, affecting the delivery of life-saving assistance to civilians impacted by this war. We reiterate that all parties must strictly comply with their obligations under international law. Any allegations of violations must be investigated and those responsible must be held accountable. On another note, and in view of the latest intensification of attacks against ships and port infrastructure in the Black Sea, we underline the importance of upholding maritime security, freedom of navigation, and respect for the law of the sea. Mr. President, the answer to the recent escalation is simple. It has been staring us in the face since the beginning of the US-led peace initiative and Ukraine's own agreement. An immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire, creating the conditions for a resumption of direct peace talks toward a negotiated settlement based on international law and the principles of the UN Charter. Greece reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. We call on the Russian Federation to end its attacks, withdraw its forces from the international recognized territory of Ukraine, and engage in good faith efforts towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Greece, along with its partners, will continue to stand with the Ukrainian people in the fight for a sovereign and independent future. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante.
I wish to thank the representative of Greece for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Director Gauthier and to Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratoué for their briefings. As we've heard today, Russia continues to escalate in its violence against Ukraine. Russia's on track to fire well over 300 missiles at Ukraine in July, a grim war record. Around half have been directed at Kyiv alone, and the consequences are clear in the rising civilian casualty figures, but also in Russia's continued attacks on civilian and commercial infrastructure. On the 19th of July, 3 cruise missiles struck a cargo ship carrying grain from Odessa, killing 10 civilians. On the 24th of July, further attacks killed and injured civilians in Kyiv and damaged the Latvian honorary consulate in Sloviansk. And Russia's reckless actions have also resulted in repeated drone incursions into Romania over the past 4 days. The United Kingdom stands in full solidarity with Ukraine, as well as with Latvia and Romania. Russia seeks to draw a parallel between its sustained bombardment of Ukrainian cities, its illegal and brutal occupation of Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine's efforts to defend itself. But there is no equivalence. Ukraine is exercising its Article 51 right to self-defense under the UN Charter. And we welcome the announcement on the 13th of July of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Coalition, which will help Ukraine better protect civilians from Russian attacks. As the General Assembly has declared repeatedly, Russia's invasion is a violation of international law. And for what benefit? Russia now spends more on compensation for the families of dead soldiers than it does on salaries for the living. Civilians are queuing for fuel across Russia. 42% of refining capacity has been disabled, and a country with some of the largest oil reserves in the world is now importing fuel. Growth has fallen, the deficit has doubled, and the real incomes of ordinary Russians continues to decline. I urge Russia to heed global calls for an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire. We all want a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, one that upholds the core principles of the UN Charter and is backed by security guarantees to prevent renewed aggression. Colleagues, as my Prime Minister has made clear ahead of his meeting today with President Zelensky, The United Kingdom remains resolute in its unwavering and its commitment to Ukraine. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Ms. Goto and Mr. Ratwate. Russia's ballistic missile and drone strikes between July 18 and 19 reportedly killed several people and injured dozens more. One of those missiles struck a civilian grain ship in the Black Sea, killing 10 crew members from India and Syria. Those casualties and countless other deaths could have been avoided had Russia answered President Trump's call to negotiate an end to this war. As we have said before, there is no military solution to this war. Both Ukraine and Russia must return to the negotiating table. Far too much blood has been spilled. The world is paying a heavy price because of this war. It must end. The United States renews its call for an immediate ceasefire and for Russia and Ukraine to negotiate in good faith a durable resolution of this war. The United States remains prepared to play a constructive role to achieve that outcome and to facilitate talks between Moscow and Kyiv. Our commitment to peace in Ukraine is unwavering. Finally, I must point out that there is a member of this council that will feign moral outrage and pretend to lecture the rest of us about every topic, whether it's about the very conflict we're discussing yet again today, or even those unrelated to international peace and security, like human rights. That is why we walked out during France's intervention. This disingenuous grandstanding is tiresome, but we have tolerated it out of a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect as P5 members. We have stood by this member state through every conflict in which their freedoms have been imperiled. And today, I remind them that it is the United States that remains the beacon of liberty for the world. As such, we will not be affording them the benefit of listening to their politicized drivel until they renounce their condescending and disrespectful rhetoric and behave in a manner commensurate with their seat on this council. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, the Kiev regime continues its terrorist attacks on peaceful Russians. On the night of July 24th, 25th, the Ukrainian UAVs hit a tourist base in the Zaporozhye region, as a result of which 12 people were killed, 5 of whom are children. 19 people were injured. On the same day, as a result of a rocket attack on one of the enterprises in the city of Kirov, 6 people were killed and 26 were injured. On July 20th, a passenger bus was attacked on the Belgorod-Shebekino highway. As a result of the drone strike, 4 women and a 16-year-old teenager were killed, 27 people were injured. During the period from July 13th to July 19th, 433 Russian civilians suffered from this shelling by the Ukrainian Nazis. 364 people were injured, including 12 children. 69 people were killed, including 2 children. In total, the armed forces of Ukraine fired 7,168 pieces of ammunition at civilian targets on Russian territory. Ukrainian militants do not stop terrorizing the personnel of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. On July 15th, as a result of a targeted strike by a Ukrainian armed forces drone on a service car, the chief engineer of the station, Alexander Yakovlev, and his driver were killed. The murder of specialists responsible for nuclear and radiation safety indicates Kiev's desire to disorganize the management of the NPP and create a threat of a large-scale man-made disaster. As we already said at the last meeting, the terror of the Kiev regime is becoming increasingly internationalized. Neither the territory of Europe nor foreign operators are immune anymore. From July 17th to July 20th, several tankers were deliberately attacked near the Caspian Pipeline Consortium Marine Terminal near Novorossiysk, including vessels chartered by Tengiz Chevroil and Kazmunay gas companies in the interest of the oil industry of Kazakhstan. This is the fifth attack on civilian facilities of the consortium which unites the largest energy enterprises in Russia, Kazakhstan, the United States, and Western European countries. Colleagues, no normal person can justify targeted strikes on sleeping tourists or buses with civilians, even though the representative of the UK did try to do just that today. But we will venture to assume the following rationale. Zelensky mistakenly expects in this way to reverse the very unfortunate situation for him at the front, so as to intimidate the civilian population of Russia, to provide an information backdrop of victory in the Ukrainian and Western media in order to continue receiving weapons and money from sponsors. The complicity and participation of Western countries in these attacks is beyond doubt. Let's look at the results of the 15th meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing held in Paris on July 13th under the co-chairmanship of France and the UK. The participants of this gathering announced their intention to continue supplying weapons to Kiev, increasing pressure on Russia, and providing support to Ukraine. At the same time, they demanded an immediate ceasefire on their terms, the start of negotiations with Russia from a position of strength, with the mandatory participation of the Europeans, as well as the maintenance of blocking of Russian assets and further tightening of sanctions. They also confirmed their intention to provide the Kiev regime with security guarantees after the ceasefire, which the meeting participants tried to present as exclusively defensive. But the content of the outcome document exposes this verbal disguise. It directly states that the multinational forces will have to restore the potential of the armed forces of Ukraine and will to provide support to Kiev on land, in the air, and at sea. In other words, behind the loud slogans about peace, there is a very simple plan: to use the respite to rearm Kiev and prepare a new round of confrontation with Russia. We have gone through this already, and this will not happen. I appeal to the European members of the Coalition of the Willing. The deployment of military contingents of your states on the territory of Ukraine will mean foreign intervention, which poses a direct threat to Russia's security. Your units will be considered by us as legitimate military targets. But European capitals have not limited themselves to the training of foreign contingents. At the same meeting, the creation of an anti-ballistic coalition with the participation of 9 states was announced. Under the guise of assurances about the exclusively defensive nature of the initiative, the Europeans intend to unite their military-industrial complexes, expand weapons production in Ukraine, and use its territory as a testing ground. It is telling that immediately after the meeting, President Macron announced the transfer of licenses for the production of Scalp cruise missiles, after 30 anti-aircraft missiles for the SAMP-P air defense systems, and hammer-guided aerial bombs. This very clearly demonstrates the hypocrisy of the coalitions. Behind the talk of defense, there is a course to expand Kiev's long-range arsenal and further escalate the conflict with Russia. Do they realize where this is leading their own countries? And this is a big question. But, Mr. President, they do know very well what this means for the Ukrainians. After all, the cynicism of Kiev's Western patrons has no bounds. For all these military plans, Zelensky will provide the infrastructure and, most importantly, his population. Ordinary citizens of Ukraine are expendable for continuing the war against Russia to the last Ukrainian. The European Union has agreed on a multi-billion-dollar loan for Kiev on the condition that the problem of the shortage of military personnel is solved. And this can only be done by tightening mobilization and lowering the conscription age. The Ukrainians themselves, by the way, do not want to die for the interest of the corrupt regime in Kiev. In Ukraine, a real manhunt of men of military age has been launched. Victims are being caught on the street and pulled out of transport, people illegally broke into private houses and apartments, and then the victims are forcibly sent to the front. Those who resist are severely beaten, including sometimes to death. The madness to which this mobilization orgy has brought Ukrainian society can be seen through the recent events in Lvov. After the representative of the Territorial Recruitment Center employees forcibly pushed a man into the car, hundreds of citizens surrounded the military commissar, smashed their cars, and one of the employees tore off his clothes. People have been driven to such despair that they are ready to tear apart the people catchers from the territorial center with their own hands. Even the representative of the Ukrainian authorities, Ombudsman Drew Prelubinets, could not stand this and said, I quote, "Society is turning into a kind of court of lynch and has almost reached the boiling point." Do Western countries care about human rights in Ukraine? Of course not, because they've already paid for the lives of these slaves with their billions and consider this to be a fairly good financial deal. The European members of the Security Council will again remain silent about what is happening. They will also pass over in complete silence over the statements of the newly minted Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Drapate, when he said, and I quote, that the Russian nation has no right to exist. Apart from us, does none of the members of the Council still see this as an outright neo-Nazism? It is also telling that it's people with such beliefs that the West wishes victory upon. They continue to talk about some kind of a turning point at the front, but they refuse to see the simple logic. If this is so, then why is Zelensky now forced to replace the Minister of Defense and the Commander-in-Chief? Is this deliberate information, or are you trying to self-convince yourselves or something? In any case, the collision between the illusion and reality is inevitable. And the reality is that the Russian army is step by step expanding its area of control, disrupting the transfer of reserves, disrupting the supply of the armed forces of Ukraine, and is consistently disabling the facilities that provide supplies to the Ukrainian military machine. An attempt to challenge, for example, the fact that the Russian forces captured Konstantinovka ended for Kiev propagandists with the fact that the military sent there with a flag and portrait of Zelensky and Syrskyi were taken prisoner. The illusion did not materialize, but in reality, these two specific Ukrainians managed to survive. On the night of July 18th to 19th, the Russian armed forces launched a massive strike with high-precision weapons and drone strikes on enterprises of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex and military logistics in Kiev and Odessa oblasts. In Kiev, the radionics, Spetoboronmash, Meridian, and Oakline enterprises involved in the production of components for the Flamingo, FP7, FP9, and Neptune MD missiles. The repair of aircraft systems, as well as the manufacture and storage of drones, were hit. Strikes were also inflicted on the sorting terminals of Nova Pochta and the logistics center in Tarasovka, which were used for the delivery and distribution of dual-use goods and components for UAVs. In the port of Yuzhny, tanks with fuel and lubricants intended to supply the armed forces of Ukraine were destroyed. On July 24th, a group strike was carried out on a facility in the suburb of Kiev, where a demonstration of Ukrainian foreign-made UAVs used to strike civilian targets on Russian territory was carried out. Once again, we emphasize that the Russian armed forces strike exclusively at specific facilities involved in supplying the armed forces of Ukraine. In itself, the formal attribution of an object to the civilian sphere does not change the nature of its actual use. Kiev, on the other hand, deliberately places military production equipment and warehouses in urban area, uses civilian enterprises and transport in the interest of the army, and then speculates on the consequences, trying to shift the responsibility for its own practice of militarization of civilian infrastructure and violation of international humanitarian law onto Russia. This is confirmed by numerous footage of the secondary explosions of objects, as was in the Kiev suburb of Vishnyovo or on the ships in the Black Sea. In conclusion, we would like to emphasize that Russia has not changed its plans and will continue to respond to the hostilities unleashed by the Kiev regime with the support of the West against southeastern Ukraine and against Russia. We will not agree to any pseudo-agreements that do not take into account Russia's national interests, and realistic proposals are still not visible. Therefore, we will continue to achieve the stated goals and objectives of the special military operation. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia. Thank you, Mr. President. Colombia is grateful for the convening of this meeting and for the information provided by Ms. Kayoko Goto, Director for Europe, Central Asia and the Americas from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations. We're also grateful for the briefing delivered by Mr. Enrique Raduate, Assistant Secretary General of Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. I also wish to welcome the delegations who are with us in the chamber today. My country deeply regrets the persistence of hostilities in Ukraine and their devastating impact on the civilian population. Recent attacks conducted against hospitals, civilian infrastructure, port infrastructure, and objects clearly documented as belonging to the United Nations and humanitarian organizations are unacceptable and must be unequivocally repudiated. In addition to worsening the suffering of civilians, attacks against port infrastructure threaten global food supply chains and imperil global food security. We reiterate our appeal to all parties to fully discharge their obligations under international law, in particular under international humanitarian law. All parties must guarantee the protection of the civilian population, the protection of humanitarian personnel, and the protection of infrastructure critical for humanitarian assistance and the well-being and survival of the population. Against this backdrop, Colombia wishes to recognize the work performed by humanitarian personnel and UN agencies who, in spite of bitterly difficult security conditions, continue to bring vital assistance to those communities most affected by the conflict. The humanitarian convoys that have succeeded in reaching areas close to the front line demonstrate that even in the midst of a confrontation, it remains possible to preserve spaces, pockets of humanity. This space must be protected as demanded by international humanitarian law, guaranteeing safe, rapid, sustained, and unfettered humanitarian access reduces the suffering of the civilian population and contributes to creating the minimal conditions required for diplomacy to take root. Mr. President, Colombia takes note of the statements expressing readiness to engage in dialogue made by the parties in myriad arenas in recent months. However, these statements must be translated into tangible and verifiable steps towards de-escalation, including towards an immediate, genuine, and effective cessation of hostilities. The desire to move towards a negotiated solution cannot be measured solely by statements made. This desire must be reflected in tangible decisions which serve to reduce violence, protect the civilian population, and preserve humanitarian space. At the same time, Colombia wishes to underscore that any political solution must be fleshed out within the framework of the United Nations Charter and international law. Precisely for this reason, my country reiterates its support for all efforts designed to promote dialogue, diplomacy, and the peaceful solution of disputes. We recognize the importance of all of them to reduce tensions and to create spaces of understanding between the parties. We also value the constructive role played by those member states who, through trusted diplomatic channels, have succeeded in forging progress, including humanitarian agreements and agreements on the return of children to their families, including measures designed to mitigate the suffering arising from the conflict. President, peace begins with decisions and actions which make it possible to rebuild trust between the parties. The intention to move towards a negotiated, peaceful, and lasting solution must go hand in hand with efforts which make it possible to rebuild the lives of communities affected so that they can live with security and dignity in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Ms. Kayoko Goto, Director for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas from the Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. And we also thank Mr. Enrique Raduate, Acting Assistant Secretary General from OCHA. We thank them both for their invaluable statements on the conflict in Ukraine, which continues to intensify. We recognize the presence of the many delegations that are in the chamber with us this morning. Since the 1st of January 2025, the Security Council has held 33 meetings on the situation in Ukraine. However, in spite of the intense and frequent nature of our discussions, we have not yet succeeded in producing tangible results which have allowed a credible path towards the end of the conflict to emerge on the horizon. After more than 4 years of war, we may well ask ourselves how many more council meetings will be necessary to convince the parties of an inescapable reality, that this conflict will have no military solution. As we speak, the human cost of this conflict continues to rise. The number of civilians killed, wounded, and displaced continue to be devastating, as do the numbers of military casualties. Humanitarian assistance continues to be targeted in attacks. Regrettably, we have received reports of damage wrought to several warehouses storing humanitarian supplies. These include facilities of the World Food Programme in Dnipro and storage warehouses managed by the World Health Organization and UNICEF in Kyiv. Moreover, we regret the attack against the Honorary Consulate of Latvia in Slovyansk. It is also a source of grave concern to note the recruitment of young people of various nationalities who are participating as fighters in this conflict. They are vulnerable to recruitment as a result of root causes which deserve our attention. And we also deeply regret that a number of them have lost their lives. President, the violations of international law and international humanitarian law have become the norm. They're constantly present. Panama reiterates its fervent appeal and indeed urges parties to achieve an immediate, comprehensive and lasting ceasefire as a vital prerequisite for paving the way towards a just and lasting peace. The time has come to demonstrate the political will and the genuine commitment necessary to achieve an agreement that will put an end to a conflict which ought never to have begun. A conflict that should have ceased a long time ago, and a conflict which has brought with it an unacceptable human cost. At the same time, it continues to erode international peace and security. Thank you. I thank the representative for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Mr. President, please allow me to start by thanking Ms. Kayoko Goto, Director for Europe and Central Asia of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, as well as Mr. Indrek Ratwate, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. I thank them for their briefings today, and I would like to welcome all of the participants in this meeting. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain is very concerned by the developments in the war in Ukraine, in particular the scale of destruction and human suffering where civilians remain hardest hit. We recall it is imperative to fully uphold international law and international humanitarian law, in particular the principles having to do with the protection of civilians and civilian goods, and uphold them under all circumstances. It's also indispensable that we have a full and comprehensive ceasefire. We therefore call on all of the parties to undertake immediate measures so as to de-escalate, protect the civilians from the consequences of this conflict, and to work in good faith towards a ceasefire so as to put an end to the bloodbath and human suffering. The Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms also that it's indispensable to adopt effective mechanism to mitigate the consequences of the conflict and protect the humanitarians and allow the humanitarians to discharge their mission despite the extreme difficult circumstances. We welcome the positive and constructive humanitarian efforts aimed at lowering the escalation and increasing the chances of arriving at a peaceful solution to the Ukrainian crisis, in particular through dialogue and diplomacy. We welcome the efforts made by the United Arab Emirates, which resulted in an exchange of 320 prisoners from both sides. Mr. President, the intensification of the use of drones and ballistic missiles in armed conflicts only amplifies the destruction and increases human losses and makes the efforts aimed at peace increasingly difficult. And that's why, once again, we warn against a growing risk having to do with the use of ballistic missiles and drones in the conflict, all the more so since the Kingdom of Bahrain, as well as other countries of the region, are currently under heinous attacks by ballistic attacks and drones from Iran, in a flagrant violation of international law, in particular humanitarian law and Security Council Resolution 2817. Despite the fact that we're not a party of that conflict. By way of conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain would like to recall our support to any and all efforts aimed at arriving at a peaceful and lasting solution through dialogue and diplomatic negotiations in line with the principles of the United Nations Charter and the provisions of international law and Security Council Resolution 2774. I thank you.
Du Bahreïn pour sa déclaration, je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Chine.
I give the floor. Thank you.
President, I thank Director Goto and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwate for their briefings. The current developments regarding the Ukraine issue are deeply concerning. Recently, multiple attacks have occurred, resulting in significant casualties and damage to infrastructure on both sides. The intensity of the conflict continues to escalate, and the sufferings of civilians are worsening, which is something no party wishes to see. This trend is extremely dangerous and must be reversed as soon as possible. I would like to make 3 points. First, the immediate priority is to achieve a ceasefire and end to the fighting. Recent developments have once again demonstrated that there are no winners in conflict and confrontation. Escalation of hostilities will only bring greater sufferings to civilians. An early ceasefire and end to the fighting serve the fundamental and long-term interests of the parties concerned and also meet the shared expectations of the international community. China urges an end to any attacks targeting civilians, calls on the parties concerned to remain calm and exercise restraint and strictly comply with international humanitarian law, protect the safety and security of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and make every effort to de-escalate the situation so as to preserve prospects for an early peace. Second, the fundamental solution lies in adhering to dialogue and negotiation. At present, major parties hold widely divergent positions, and the path to negotiations remains difficult and challenging. But history has shown that conflicts can only be resolved through negotiations. As long as talks begin and continue, there remains hope for peace. China calls on the relevant parties to maintain engagement, demonstrate political will, build mutual trust through dialogue, accumulate consensus through negotiations, and strive to reach a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement. Third, the long-term approach is to pursue common security. Russia, Ukraine, and the European countries are neighbors that cannot move away from one another. Achieving harmonious coexistence and pursuing common security is the only realistic choice. China calls on all relevant parties to abandon Cold War mentality and block confrontation, uphold a vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, properly address each other's legitimate security concerns, and on the basis of full, complete, and comprehensive adherence to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, eliminate the root causes of crisis, and promote the building of a balanced, effective, and sustainable regional security architecture to achieve lasting peace and stability in the region. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue has been consistent, always guided by the 4 shoulds proposed by President Xi Jinping. We believe that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis should be supported. China firmly supports a ceasefire to play a constructive role in advancing a political settlement of the crisis. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we thank Director Goto and Acting ASG Ratwati for their briefings. As we gather here again, we remain deeply concerned by the ongoing hostilities and the continued worsening of this humanitarian and security situation in Ukraine. Recent developments demonstrate that the longer this conflict continues, the longer human suffering is prolonged and the prospect for sustainable peace diminished. Mr. President, we are deeply troubled by the continuous escalation of military actions, including those targeting civilian and civilian infrastructure. The protection of civilian and civilian infrastructure are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. In this regard, we call on all parties to strictly adhere to their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law, and to protect schools, hospitals, and homes. Mr. President, we are convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Diplomacy and dialogue are the only viable means to bring this crisis to an end. We reiterate that all parties must prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and commit to an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. Mr. President, while we note the complex challenges surrounding the diplomatic engagement, we acknowledge the high-level contacts and discussions aimed at exploring pathways toward peace. We encourage all international efforts and bilateral engagement that seek to build trust and establish constructive path toward de-escalation of hostilities. A durable and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of the conflict and fully be consistent with the purpose and the principles of the United Nations Charter. Lasting peace will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and a shared vision of common and sustainable security. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts to achieve a resolution that restores peace, security, stability in the region. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this conflict deserve peace, prosperity, and dignity. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I join in thanking the briefers for their qualified insights. Liberia takes the floor in a dual capacity. As an elected member of this council and as the world's leading flag state, representing over 300 million gross tons and 17% of global merchant shipping. We speak from the decks of targeted civilian vessels, on behalf of targeted civilian crews on the high seas, and an international economy straining under the weight of the war in Ukraine. Mr. President, in the strongest terms, Liberia condemns the strike on the LPG tanker Gas Lisbon in international waters, which killed one civilian seafarer and injured 3 others. We extend our deepest condolences to his family and our solidarity to the survivors. These mariners wore no uniform, no military uniforms, carried no weapons, and sought no combat. They were civilian workers keeping the world powered and fed. The subsequent damage to the bulk carrier Christiana B confirms that these attacks are no longer isolated incidents. They represent a systematic and concerning threat to global maritime commerce. Excellencies, attacks on merchant shipping are not merely tragic incidents. They are direct violations of international humanitarian law, breaches of International Maritime Organization safety norms, and a flagrant denial of the freedom of the high seas guaranteed under Article 87 of UNCLOS. When combat zones engulf international waters, the consequences do not stop at the Black Sea coast. More than 80% of global trade moves by sea. When maritime trade routes become shooting galleries, war risk insurance spikes, supply chains stall, and energy and food prices, as we have heard, surge. For developing nations, particularly across Africa, these translate directly into higher fuel prices at the pump, pricing of food on the family table, and an unjust tax on the developing world paid by ordinary citizens, most of whom cannot afford it. While the destruction within Ukraine and the expanding theater of the war is devastating, including to civilians and civilians' infrastructure, and in the deaths of civilian, and especially attacks, heartbreaking attacks against civilian infrastructure, its ripple effect on global food and energy security affects us all. This brings us, therefore, to the fundamental reality of this crisis. We view the persistent refusal to abandon military escalation not as strength, but as a fatal diplomatic intransigence, a tragic unwillingness to face the inescapable truth of this conflict. History offers us a stark, unyielding lesson. When this war finally ends, as all wars inevitably do, it will end at a negotiation table with mostly the same diplomatic interventions that are available to the parties today. The principles of sovereignty and international law will not change. The only difference between a settlement reached today and a settlement reached years from now is the intervening death, irreversible destruction, and wasted human life that no treaty can ever undo. Every day of delay, therefore, adds nothing to the ultimate compromise. It merely expands the graveyard. Excellencies, the world cannot afford an indefinite war of attrition, nor can we accept the premise that a lasting solution can be achieved on the battlefield alone. Military victories, as Liberia painfully learned, are fleeting and blood-soaked. A negotiated peace rooted in international law is sustainable and enduring. Under the leadership of the Democratic Republic of the Congo this month, this council has focused on Chapter 6 mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes. That focus must now move from mere debates in this chamber to concrete action across global hotspots, including the war in Ukraine. Therefore, Liberia calls for an immediate, durable ceasefire, accompanied by urgent operational de-escalation, including demilitarized maritime safety corridors for commercial energy and green routes, and a renewed commitment to diplomatic talks. Specifically, Mr. President, Liberia urges all parties to, 1, agree to an immediate ceasefire and engage in direct high-level peace negotiations. 2, uphold international humanitarian law and UNCLOS Article 87 by guaranteeing the safety of civilian mariners and commercial vessels. 3, preserve unhindered freedom of navigation through established maritime safety zones in the Black Sea. And 4, cooperate fully with an impartial international investigation into attacks on civilian shipping. Mr. President, the oceans are the arterial system of global commerce and human survival. They must never become collateral victims of war. The Security Council, therefore, must act with unified resolve. Let us help silence the guns on land so that we may restore safety on the seas and deliver the peace that the international community demands, the people of Ukraine desire, and the people of Russia, I am sure, need. I thank you for your kind attention.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. Now I'm going to make a statement in my capacity as representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Rather, I'm giving the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Director Kayoko Goto and ASG Indrika Ratwate for their briefings. President, the continued conflict in Ukraine, particularly the escalation in intensity and frequency of attacks by the parties, is deeply concerning. We are also concerned by the reported attacks against infrastructure critical to global food and security, energy security. The ripple effect of such actions negatively impact lives and livelihoods far beyond the conflict zone, especially in the global south. Equally reprehensible is the harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure from the incessant fighting. We are alarmed by the reported targeting of humanitarian actors and associated infrastructure. President, we reiterate the call for all parties to fully abide by their international humanitarian law obligations. Violation of the widely accepted and well-established principles of IHL risks escalation, deepens mistrust, exacerbates human suffering, and further diminishes the prospect for peace. It is evident that durable peace and stability could only be achieved if the parties were to commit to an earnest, sustained, and meaningful dialogue. The quest for a military solution will only lead to more devastation, suffering, and consequences beyond the region. It is unfortunate that we are in this situation 17 months after the adoption of Resolution 2774 proposed by the US and supported by Pakistan and other council members. That particular resolution mourned the tragic loss of life. It reiterated the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes and implored a swift end to the conflict and urged a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. That resolution must be implemented. We therefore underscore the need for an immediate and complete cessation of hostilities, creating space for diplomacy and resumption of dialogue. A mutually acceptable, peaceful settlement consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and corresponding to the legitimate security interests of all sides and the relevant multilateral agreements remains the only viable path. Pakistan will continue to support all endeavors aimed at achieving a just, comprehensive, durable, and peaceful resolution of this conflict. I thank you.
Je remercie le
I thank the representative of Pakistan for that statement. I will now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
membre du Conseil.
Distinguished members of the Council, the Democratic Republic of the Congo thanks Ms. Kayoko Goto, a Director for Europe and Central Asia, Departments of Political and Peace-Building Affairs and Peace Operations. We also thank Mr. Indrika Ratwate, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. We thank them for their presentations. The informations we have been receiving about the situation in Ukraine remain deeply alarming. The first weeks of 2026 seemed to provide a glimpse of a possible lull and give us hope for a way out of the crisis. But the months that followed, unfortunately, only confirmed the lasting and continued violence, which continues to claim its share of civilian victims. The Democratic Republic of the Congo remains deeply concerned by the continuation and intensification of the hostilities, despite the Council's repeated calls for de-escalation and restraint. We must acknowledge that the military logic continues to prevail over political and diplomatic efforts, the efforts which are essential for a lasting settlement of this conflict. And this development only aggravates the humanitarian consequences of the war and increases the suffering of the civilians. The information brought to the Council's attention in recent days, as well as the developments referred to by our speakers, are a reminder once again of the urgent need to put an end to the suffering of the suffering populations, suffering and exhausted by more than 4 years of the war. The Democratic Republic of the Congo expresses its deep sympathy to all the civilian victims of the conflict and reaffirms its solidarity with the impacted populations wherever they may be. We also take this opportunity to reiterate that civilian populations and the infrastructure which are essential for their survival must never be targeted. It must be fully protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. Indeed, our outrage can only be heightened when the statistics presented by the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine show a 37% increase in the number of civilian casualties in the first half of 2026 compared with the same period in 2025. This figures shows very clearly the growing human cost of the conflict and confirms that the continuation of the military logic continues to hit civilian populations on both sides of the border. Distinguished members of the Council, we reaffirm our deep commitment to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and to respect for international law and international humanitarian law. And we therefore recall that there can be no military solution to this conflict. Each new offensive, regardless of its origin, prolongs the violence, increases human suffering, and further pushes away the prospects for a lasting peace. My delegation therefore reiterates our call for the cessation of hostilities, the effective protection of the civilian population and the infrastructure which is essential to their survival, and the establishment of a ceasefire that can create conditions conducive to a genuine political process. The Democratic Republic of the Congo remains aware of the diversity of perceptions surrounding the origins, development, and responsibilities related to this conflict, and recalls, however, that this plurality of assessment should never lead to a diplomatic paralysis. Indeed, my delegation maintains that genuine peace can be achieved only if the concerns of all parties are heard and addressed responsibly. for the mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes in the wake of Resolution 2788. This debate was a timely reminder that the Charter of the United Nations provides states with a set of instruments for preventive diplomacy and the peaceful settlement of disputes, including negotiation, mediation, reconciliation, arbitration, and judicial settlement. And the full recourse to these remains more necessary now than ever. The Democratic Republic of the Congo therefore calls on the parties to resume, without delay, a frank, sincere, and inclusive dialogue conducted in good faith with the support of the United Nations on all actors likely to contribute in an impartial and constructive manner to the rapprochement of positions. These efforts must be aimed at the achievement of a just, lasting, and mutually acceptable peace with respect for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. And the Security Council cannot limit itself to periodically noting the deterioration of the situation. It's up to the Council to preserve the channels of diplomacy, to support credible mediation initiatives, and to encourage all steps likely to promote a lasting de-escalation. In conclusion, the Democratic Republic of the Congo remains convinced that only a political solution will make it possible to put a lasting end to this conflict. Our collective responsibility is to silence the guns, to stop the continuation of violence which strikes civilian populations, and to create conditions conducive to a just, lasting, and mutually acceptable peace. To that end, my delegation will continue to support any credible initiative based on dialogue, preventive diplomacy, and the peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter.
I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of France has asked for the floor to make an additional statement. I give him the floor. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we this year celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States, and everyone knows, is all too aware, that France took place in those celebrations. A few days ago, the Statue of Liberty, not very far from here, was lit up. We are acutely aware of the fact that it was at San Francisco that the Charter was adopted, and that the United Nations was created with the goal of working towards international peace and security, human rights and development. All of that forms the spirit in which France works within the United Nations, at the Security Council, the General Assembly. We work to preserve this institution, its independence, its ability to act in service of the Charter, and act to serve human rights and peace in the fora that bring us together. And indeed, in today's debate, our goal is to continue working alongside all those who bring peace initiatives to the table so that Ukraine can return to peace, security, its territorial integrity, and its absolute sovereignty. I thank you. I wish to thank the representative of France for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Presidency of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this meeting, and the delegations of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, and the United Kingdom for supporting our request. I also want to thank to our distinguished briefers, Director Goto and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwater, for providing new evidence for the war crimes that were committed by Russian Federation against Ukrainian civilians. I would like to start my statement by quoting the famous words of Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor for the United States at the Nuremberg trials. I quote, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated." End of the quote. Yet, It seems that the international community still tolerates the repetition of heinous war crimes committed by the Russian Federation, which cynically fabricates pretexts to justify its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. We've just heard from the Russian representative who manufactured artificial threats to mask Russian deliberate violations of international law. It seemed that there are no limitations for Moscow and no red lines for the rest of the international community. During the night of July 18th and 19th, Russia launched the largest ballistic missile attack since the start of the full-scale military aggression against Ukraine. They used 41 missiles and 125 UAVs against Kyiv and the Kyiv region. Russian deadly strikes were also recorded in Kharkiv, Sumy, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. On July 23rd, a Russian bomb targeted the city of Pavlograd, the Dnipropetrovsk region, killing 3 and injuring 28 people. On July 24th, 3 Russian missiles killed 11 people and injured close to 100 in Kyiv region. The same day, Russia struck and destroyed the building of the honorary consulate of Latvia in Slavyansk, Donetsk region, as was mentioned by briefers and our partners here. Last Friday, a Russian drone struck a supermarket in Chernihiv, killing 2 people, including a 10-year-old girl. 25 people were injured as a result of the attack. This was not an accident or collateral damage. It was yet another cynical and barbaric act of terror against civilians. Russia continues to deliberately target places where ordinary people live, work, shop, and it demonstrates utter contempt for human life. Mr. President, Russia continues to escalate its war of aggression against Ukraine, and this is an undeniable fact, as it was also confirmed by briefers. Recently, Russia has intensified a deliberate campaign against Ukrainian grain exports and is actively attempting to block maritime trade routes in Black Sea. By doing so, Russia wants to disrupt Ukraine's ability to export agricultural products, intimidate commercial shipping, and put pressure on global food markets. Since the beginning of Russian full-scale military invasion, at least 1,054 port infrastructure facilities have been damaged or partially destroyed. 232 civilian vessels have been damaged, and 307 civilians have been killed or injured as a result of Russian deliberate campaign of terror, which targets Ukraine port infrastructure and civilian shipping. In June and July alone, Russia attacked almost 50 cargo ships. These attacks killed more than 30 people. The most recent and one of the gravest incidents occurred on 19th July, when 3 Russian cruise missiles struck the Guinea-Bissau flagged bulk carrier Golden Leo, owned by a Turkish company. The vessel was attacked while carrying Ukrainian grain through a maritime corridor. 10 people were killed, including a Ukrainian maritime pilot, while 8 crew members were rescued. The vessel posed no military threat. Yesterday, the Golden Leo sank off the coast to Odessa. On the same days, Russia attacked another foreign commercial vessel sailing under the flag of Antigua and Barbuda near Odessa, killing 1 crew member and injuring 3 others. Another civilian vessel under the flag of Republic of Marshall Islands was struck in the port of Odessa, leaving 4 crew members injured. Within less than 48 hours, Russia attacked 3 separate foreign merchant vessels operating near Ukrainian ports. Ukraine expresses its deepest condolences to the families and all seafarers and port personnel killed in these attacks. Russian attacks caused injuries among civilian seafarers from Ukraine, Egypt, Syrian Arab Republic, and India. Thus, such attacks have an impact on interests of many members of this organization. These facts are difficult to explain as coincidence or accident. These are deliberate actions. Since 22nd July 2026, maritime exports through Ukraine's ports have been suspended as a result of Russian attacks on civilian commercial vessels. The implications of this fact are obvious, and the timing of these attacks is particularly revealing. They are taking place at the height of harvest season, when millions of tons of Ukrainian agricultural products are expected to reach global markets. According to Ukrainian authorities, since the beginning of July alone, 31 merchant vessels have come under attack. Russia understands perfectly well what their consequences for such actions may have. More than 90% of Ukraine agriculture exports pass through Black Sea ports. Such attacks put the pressure on global food markets and increase uncertainty for countries that depend on Ukrainian agricultural export. And the consequences are felt far beyond Ukraine in Europe. Millions of families in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Middle East ultimately pay the price when the grain shipments are disrupted, transport costs increase, and commercial shipping becomes more dangerous. Mr. President, in 2022, with the help of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres and our Turkish partners, we established the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It made an important contribution to global food security. Russia later withdrew from the initiative unilaterally. Having taken that decision, it subsequently attempted to place responsibility on the United Nations and the Secretary General. We have categorically rejected such allegations. It's Russia who withdrew from the initiative by its own choice, disrupted a mechanism that benefited countries across multiple continents, and now questions the role of the institutions that helped make that mechanism possible. Delegations can assess these facts for themselves. Ukraine, in its part, expresses its full support for the Secretary General and his consistent position in defense of the Charter of the United Nations, international peace, and international security. We have launched the maritime corridor in the Black Sea in order to support these efforts, while Russia continues to target them with missiles and drones. One important fact should not be overlooked. Nobody is attacking Russian grain routes, striking Russian merchant vessels, or destroying its grain terminals. Ukraine implements its right to self-defense guaranteed by the UN Charter with the caution and respect for international law. Our forces attack only Russia's military potential and facilities which support Russia's war machine. We never wanted this war. When Ukraine strikes military airfields, military bases, ammunition, and fuel facilities that support Russian war effort, the war simply returns to where it originated. On the contrary, Russia attacks Ukrainian ports, grain terminals, and commercial vessels, and expects the international community to accept such terror. Russian terror against civilians and the threats to global food security must end. The United Nations must make full use of all appropriate tools at its disposal, including those provided by international law, to put an end to attacks against civilians, restore freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, and ensure the safety and security of seafarers who continue to suffer from these attacks. Defending freedom of navigation has long been a priority for the Security Council, and we take note of its recent initiatives and resolutions addressing these actions of destructive actors threatening maritime security on important international routes. The deteriorating situation in the Black Sea also requires the urgent attention and action without further delay. And we also would welcome those good offices that would help ensure Russia's full compliance with its obligations under international law, including the law of the sea. Mr. President, yet Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine extends far beyond the missile strikes, attacks against ports, or attempts to disrupt global food supplies. While the world sees burning ships in the Black Sea and destroyed apartment buildings in Ukrainian cities, tens of thousands of Ukrainians remain trapped behind prison walls in the temporarily occupied territories and inside Russian Federation itself. Their only crime was defending their country, refusing occupation, speaking Ukrainian, or remaining loyal to their homeland. 96% of released Ukrainian prisoners of war interviewed by the OHCHR reported torture or other forms of ill treatment. Nearly 90% reported conflict-related sexual violence. At least 109 Ukrainian prisoners of war have been executed after capture, while dozens more have died in custody. Civilian detainees have been subjected to the same machinery of abuse. Torture remains widespread and systematic. At least 182 civilians have been executed in areas under Russian control, including in places of detention. Many others never returned alive from captivity. The return of all our citizens is our paramount importance for us and the United Nations and the international community, and we should play an active role in this process. Every day spent in Russian captivity is another day of suffering that international law was created to prevent. The return of every prisoner of war and every legally detained civilian, as well as unlawfully deported Ukrainian children, must remain an international priority until the last Ukrainian comes home. Mr. President, the picture that emerges from everything we have discussed today is remarkably consistent. Whether we speak about missile strikes against residential neighborhoods, attacks against grain terminals and merchant vessels, or torture chambers hidden behind the prison walls, we are dealing with different manifestations of the same policy. As Voltaire once famously said, those who can make people believe absurdities can make people commit atrocities. This is what Russian society is going through, and those responsible bear full responsibility for these war crimes. Moscow does not cherish the lives of its own citizens, as imperial ambitions remain at the top of its agenda. All efforts by Ukraine and our allies to restore peace have been met with escalation by Russia. Everything indicates today that Russia is preparing for a new wave of mobilization, destruction, and deaths. And as President Zelensky recently indicated, Russia wants 30,000 more troops from the DPRK to support the operation. Yet another demonstration of the Kremlin's regime malicious intentions was deranged by the history lesson delivered by the Russia's ruler yesterday evening. His distorted understanding of history and the world, coupled with yet another attempt to shift blame for the regime's own crimes onto others, is far more than effort to justify Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It is a diagnosis of an entire system that can survive only by feeding on bloodshed, suffering, and fear. Such rhetoric once again exposes the true nature of the Kremlin regime, one built on lies, violence, and imperial ambition. Thus, we call on our partners to put all efforts into real steps, which will restore comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. This requires increasing support for Ukraine, strengthening pressure on Russia, and further weakening its war capabilities. And we also echo the same request that was announced today by our partners. It's time for action, not deliberations. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. Now in the 5th year of its full-scale aggression against Ukraine, Russia shows no signs of abandoning its imperialistic objectives in subjugating Ukraine. Recent weeks have seen some of the most intensive aerial attacks since the full-scale invasion began. Combined missile and drone strikes hit cities across Ukraine, killing and injuring civilians and destroying homes, hospitals, schools, and other essential infrastructure. A Russian strike on a UNICEF warehouse in Bilohorodka destroyed humanitarian supplies worth nearly $4 million. On the 24th of July, a Russian strike destroyed the premises of Latvia's honorary consulate in Sloviansk, in clear violation of international diplomatic norms. We condemn these unlawful and typical attacks in the strongest possible terms. Unable to break Ukraine's resistance, Russia seeks to terrorize the population through intensified so-called human safari drone attacks near the front lines. Attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks, are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Destroying essential infrastructure on which millions depend serves no legitimate military purpose. The same pattern is evident in the Black Sea. With the harvest season on the way, Russia is attacking grain-carrying civilian cargo ships, leaving dozens of international crew members from Egypt, Syria, India killed and injured. Deliberately disrupting Ukraine's maritime export corridor, Russia is targeting global food markets, raising risk of hunger for millions in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. We call on this Council and the wider international community to condemn these attacks and demand that Russia cease them immediately. We also express our solidarity with Romania for the repeated drone incursions into their airspace. Russia's reckless behavior needs to stop. Mr. President, Russia's armed and security forces have been repeatedly listed in the annexes to the Secretary General's reports for grave violation against children and are now also listed for conflict-related sexual violence, following the verification of 310 cases of such violence against Ukrainians. Security Council Resolution 2242 welcomed the Secretary General's decision that all countries repeatedly listed in the annexes to his reports are prohibited from participating in UN peacekeeping operations. Forces repeatedly implicated in these abuses cannot credibly protect vulnerable populations under the UN flag. We urge the Secretary General to apply this decision consistently and the Council to uphold and implement its unanimously adopted resolution. We urge Russia to immediately end the indoctrination and militarization of Ukrainian children and ensure the return of all those unlawfully deported and forcibly transferred. We also urge Russia to release all Ukrainian prisoners of war and unlawfully detained civilians and ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need, including in Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories. Every victim deserves justice, and Russia's actions must be met with accountability. We support the International Criminal Court and the swift establishment and operationalization of the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine. We call on all member states to support and assist the ICC and the Special Tribunal in their mission to fight impunity, bring justice to victims, and prevent future international crimes. The Baltic states reiterate their call for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, grounded in the UN Charter and international law. Such peace cannot be imposed upon Ukraine or reward aggression. We will continue to stand with Ukraine and reaffirm our unwavering support for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Estonia for that statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Quentin Weiler from the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, align themselves with this statement. I thanked the DRC presidency for convening this meeting, and I thank the briefers for the factual updates. The death and destruction caused by Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine continues unabated. The UN has verified over 2,000 civilian casualties in June alone, the highest in 4 years. Almost all occurred in Ukraine's urban centers as a result of Russian aerial bombardments. While the world demands a ceasefire and negotiations, Russia responds with brutal attacks against Ukraine's cities and their population. Last week, it destroyed Latvia's honorary consulate in Sloviansk, and as others in this room, I express full solidarity with Latvia. We are now also seeing a trend of attacks against humanitarian workers, bringing relief to people living close to the front lines. By every standard is it set for itself, Russia is not achieving its objectives. It spends 40% of its budget on its military and security. It has suffered over 1 million casualties for minimal territorial gains. It stands isolated internationally, and its economy is under heavy strain. The fact that this cynical brutality against civilians is now fueled by Russians' desperation with its failure on the battlefield excuses neither its inhumanity nor its blatant violations under international law. In fact, it compounds them both. The EU continues to stand firmly in defense of international law as enshrined in the UN Charter. We will continue to support Ukraine in exercising its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter. We have mobilized over 200 billion euros to this end, all in response to an illegal invasion by a permanent member of this Council. We continue to call for a full, unconditional and immediate ceasefire, as well as a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on international law, including the UN Charter. We call on Russia and its ally Belarus to immediately ensure the safe and unconditional return of all unlawfully deported and transferred Ukrainian children. We urge all countries, including the members of this Council, to cease any assistance or diplomatic cover to Russia, whether direct or indirect. Colleagues, Russia cannot succeed in changing borders by force or in escaping accountability for its actions. The sooner Russia realizes this, and the sooner it ends its aggression and comes to the negotiating table, the sooner this senseless cycle of death and destruction has a chance to end. We urge all members of this Council to work with us in pressuring Russia to do so and to ensure full accountability for war crimes and the other most serious crimes committed in this war of aggression. The time for a ceasefire is now. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Weiler for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Monsieur le Président, I thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this meeting. I'll also thank the briefers for the informative presentations. Despite heavy losses on the battlefield and mounting economic problems, Russia remains unwilling to end its war of aggression against Ukraine. On the contrary, it systematically targets Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, causing civilian casualties and depriving thousands of people of access to essential services. Last week, Russia added the honorary consulate of Latvia and Slovenia to the deliberate targets of its strikes. Poland condemns these actions in the strongest possible terms and calls, yet again, on Russia to stop the war. The recent escalation of Russian attacks against Ukraine's Black Sea ports and commercial vessels is already disrupting maritime traffic and poses a serious threat to Ukraine's export capacity, particularly with regard to agricultural products. These deliberate attacks undermine not only Ukraine's economy, but also global food security and the fundamental principle of freedom of navigation. Poland strongly condemns the recent drone incursions into Romanian airspace. Russia's provocation, especially across the eastern flank of NATO, from Estonia through Poland to Romania and other allies, are clear violations of international law. Mr. President, this Council has repeatedly heard Moscow's narrative about the alleged root causes of the war and its so-called legitimate security concerns. These are propaganda slogans that bear no resemblance to reality. It is time to stop repeating these narratives and instead focus on the facts. Ukraine was not a NATO member in February 2022, nor was its accession imminent. Claims that Ukraine or NATO pose a threat to Russia's sovereignty were never supported by the strategic realities preceding this invasion. Indeed, when one listens to Russia's bizarre justification for this war, it becomes increasingly difficult to understand what really objectives Moscow claims to be pursuing. Its explanations are detached from reality. We therefore call on all members of this Council to reject these false narratives and remain guided by the facts. And the fact is that Russia's revisionist neo-colonial policy long predates 2022. For years, Moscow has sought to preserve a sphere of influence over its neighbors through military aggression, coercive diplomacy, economic pressure, cyber operations, and disinformation. This is not the behavior of a state acting in self-defense. This is the behavior of a state pursuing domination and imperialism. Russia's rhetoric about the legitimate security concerns reflects its outdated imperial mindset rather than any genuine response to an immediate threat. It is Russia that has become the principal source of insecurity in Europe. The only way to address the so-called root causes of this war is for Russia to change its own policy. In the meantime, Ukraine has an inherent right to defend itself against Russia, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the path to peace is clear. It requires pressure on Russia by the international community, including the members of this Council, so that Russia finally engages in meaningful negotiations. We call on all the United Nations member states committed to peace, international law, and the Charter to strengthen these efforts. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.